Hello and welcome to 5 Steps to Assessing Community Needs. I'm Andy King, a training specialist with the Corporation for National and Community Service in Washington, D.C. I'll be the host for today's webinar. Joining me today are Bethany DeSablin and Joanne Lau with our partners at Education Northwest. They're producing the session and have helped to prepare today's webinar. They'll be supporting all of us with the WebEx technology. You'll see them and me in the chat and the Q&A to help address questions or issues that may come up during the session. As we take a look at this topic, I want to sort of look back and talk a little bit about the VISTA program's philosophy as it relates to community assessment. You'll recall that there are 4 key principles of the VISTA program. You see those listed there on the slide. For this webinar, we're going to look at the second principle, that is, empowering communities. In contrast to parachuting in and doing good things for people, VISTA members live among and involve community members in planning and carrying out their VISTA project. This is often facilitated by your sponsoring organization, and the process probably started with the development of the initial concept paper that was submitted for your VISTA project. And hopefully it continues through some sort of community advisory group. Strengthening and improving the community is our long-term goal through learning about the values and beliefs, the assumptions, using community development principles and tenets of good practice. An important approach to learning about community and its assets and needs is through some sort of community assessment. So that's why we want to introduce you to a community assessment model that you can adapt to suit the needs of your VISTA project and your individual assignment. This webinar is going to take a slightly different format from some of our other webinars. It's going to be a live webcast of a consultation session between a currently serving VISTA member and a community engagement expert. As they walk through the steps of assessing community needs, you'll learn about this assessment process as well as some important aspects of navigating through it. So our hope, our desired outcomes for this session is that by the end, you'll be able to, first of all, articulate the value of conducting a community needs assessment as it pertains to your project and your service, that you'll be able to define and characterize the various elements that are involved in conducting a community assessment, and finally, that you'll be able to walk away knowing how to apply the assessment process to your own VISTA project. All right, so that's what we're going to cover. Let's begin by introducing our consultant. Shannon Stober is a VISTA alum, first and foremost, who now owns Verve Exchange Consulting, which is based in Bozeman, Montana. Shannon has been working as a National Service staff member, a trainer, and consultant for more than 15 years. After graduating from college, Shannon served both as a VISTA member and a VISTA leader, after which she joined the staff of the Montana Governor's Office of Community Service, where she served as the statewide training officer. Since that time, she has overseen thousands of AmeriCorps members and staff with positions with the Montana Campus Compact and Montana Conservation Corps. Shannon currently works as an independent consultant. She regularly provides one-on-one coaching and mentoring to national service members and community members alike, with a focus on assessing community needs, engaging stakeholders, and implementing programs through the use of the community building lifecycle. So, she's perfect for this role today. Shannon, thank you so much for taking time to be here with us.
Absolutely, Andy. I'm really happy to be here and appreciate your warm introduction, and hello to everybody out there listening. So just to begin, I agree that the community assessment is an important topic for VISTAs. In my work as a consultant providing strategic guidance to nonprofits, I found that you won't be effective unless you understand the community you've set out to serve. I've seen highly respected organizations become nearly obsolete because they lost touch with the community and no longer understood what it needed and what assets were available. Without that key information, it's so easy to keep doing what you've always done, even when it's no longer useful, or to veer off in a new direction that also misses the mark in regards to what the community wants and needs. So taking time to do a community assessment before launching any new initiative is time well spent.
Shannon, when we spoke earlier, I mentioned that I wanted to connect you with a currently serving VISTA member whose VISTA assignment includes completing a community needs assessment for her own community. So let's bring her into the conversation. Jackie Taybone is an AmeriCorps VISTA member serving with the Washington Campus Compact at Whatcom Community College in Bellingham, which is a small city in northwest Washington state. After graduating from Western Washington University with a BA in Human Services, Jackie found a VISTA position that combined her interest in human services and education and offered her a good way to try out indirect service after previous experience conducting direct service. Jackie's VISTA assignment includes the task of completing a community needs assessment. Since this is something that she hadn't done before, Jackie did what any good VISTA would do. She reached out to the VISTA community through the forums on the VISTA campus to see what advice others could offer. I happened to see that post, and so I reached out to see if Jackie would like to be part of this webinar, and obviously she said yes. So Jackie, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Andy. Happy to be here.
All right, so we have Shannon Stober of Verge Exchange Consulting, who's offered to provide Jackie with some additional insight into completing a community needs assessment.
Hey, Jackie.
Hi, Shannon.
All right, so to get us started, Jackie, why don't you tell us a little bit about the project that you're working on?
Sure. So my title for Whatcom Community College's VISTA project is the Youth Connections Coordinator. The goal of the project is to increase the number of young people who've been pushed out of high school or close to dropping out and having access to post-secondary education. So according to my VAD, in the first year of the project, I'll develop a community assessment plan, develop curriculum, and cultivate partnerships with community partners in order to increase college access for out-of-school youth, homeless youth, and/or incarcerated youth. And then after that, my goal for the rest of the year is to develop a mentorship program with a specific focus on financial literacy, navigating the college experience, increasing knowledge, and working towards high school diploma, GED completion, and visits on college campuses.
So Jackie, I connected with you after you posted your question to the VISTA forum, where you were asking for tips about how to conduct a community assessment. Tell us more about why you reached out with that question. What were you hoping to find?
Well, I posted the question because I was given a lot of freedom with how to go about doing the community assessment on my VAD, and so I wasn't sure where to start. There are many resources that I found that were out there, but I wanted to hear from actual people who were VISTAs.
Makes good sense. I'm really glad you reached out because I think there are many members, many VISTAs out there who struggle with the same issues and probably have similar questions. When I saw your post, I thought about our colleague, Shannon Stober, and wondered if she might be a resource for you. So I'm going to hand this over to the two of you to walk through the process and learn more about community assessments.
Thanks, Andy. All right, Jackie, so where would you like to start?
So I know that in a community assessment, I need data like census data and direct input from the people who this project will impact. I have some idea where to go, but I'm not super sure where to start and how to implement a solid work plan.
Okay, that totally makes sense. So let's start by taking a look at a tool that I use called the Community Building Lifecycle, which provides a broad overview of how the various service activities that you might undertake relate to each other and lead towards sustainability and impact. This should help you gain a sense of how you'll want to sequence your activities, how they work together, and where you'll want to begin. Once we review that, I'll walk you through a simple 5-step model that I use, which should help you pull your assessment together. Does that sound good?
Yeah, sounds good.
Great. Okay, so here's an image that represents the community building life cycle. Now, this was a model that was used to train me when I was an incoming VISTA, and it's been an invaluable tool in all of my efforts since that time. So let's quickly unpackage what this image is telling us, which will help you better understand how to sort through your work plan. So you'll notice that the entire cycle revolves around community need. There's a reason why you're all being asked to generate so much data regarding your community and think so critically about the needs of the community that you're serving. The success of your project really depends upon being in alignment with your community, and if you don't do the work here, there's a really good chance that you're going to miss the mark. You have to be able to articulate that need using facts and data and connect the need to the things that matter most in your community and the services that are already provided, which, speaking broadly, is the purpose of your community assessment. So when you look at the model, you'll see that the first step is to complete a community needs assessment where you're going to identify community needs, assets, services, and institutions. You'll use this information to identify service gaps and then determine what work needs to be done and what your organization is capable of doing. Once you have that information, you'll start to conduct outreach in order to raise awareness within the community about what you've discovered and what other opportunities or threats might exist. Your goal here is to reach out to people and help them understand the issues associated with the need that you've identified and begin discussing the various things that can be done to address it. Now, once you've raised awareness, you can move towards pulling together your community stakeholders in an advisory capacity. Advisory groups are in place to ensure that your planning and implementation efforts are aligned with the community need and that your solutions are understood and agreed upon. Once your advisory entity is in place, then you can get planning. This is where you will collaboratively set your goals and objectives, build timelines, and clarify roles. Once the plan is done, then you move into implementation. The final piece is to evaluate the work, where you'll measure your impact, figure out what's working, what's not working, and begin the process all over again. So you'll notice this is a cyclical process. It's not a linear one, which represents the need to consistently revisit the steps and make sure that your work is in alignment with the community need. As a VISTA, this is super important for you to keep in mind. One of the largest parts of your role will be to oversee this process and not get sidetracked and stuck in implementation. So with that, when we're looking at your VAD, we see 4 primary goals. We have building an advisory group, completing the assessment, developing a mentoring program curriculum, and developing some partnerships. So based upon what this model is telling us, how do you think you should sequence your work?
Well, when looking this over, it seems like starting with the assessment is really important, and then when that's complete, I can put together an advisory group and then work with that group to develop curriculum.
Yes, exactly. Now, as far as building partnerships, I want to point out that you can and really should be building partnerships at every step of the cycle. Since we're talking about assessment today, I'll mention that assessment represents a great opportunity to explore potential partnerships, get a sense of what other organizations and stakeholders have to offer, and think about how your organization might be able to support and collaborate. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I do have a concern, though. So I didn't realize that I was supposed to do the assessment before building an advisory group, so I already have an advisory group, even though the assessment's not complete. What are your thoughts on that?
Now, first of all, let me just say, don't worry about that too much. People work out a sequence all the time because they aren't really aware that there's a process that can be used. So what you'll want to do is share the information that we cover today with your advisory group and get them to help you with your assessment and outreach strategies. So the upside is now you have concrete roles to provide them, and you have a team of people to help you interpret your assessment. So just be transparent with them about what we learn and go over today. I'm sure that they'll appreciate it.
Okay, that makes sense.
Okay, great. So before we move on, I do want to share one observation I have with you, though. So based upon your VAD, it seems like a decision has already been made to develop a mentoring program, although the intention of the assessment is to identify gaps for underserved youth. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Okay. Keep an eye on that. Your organization may have already done the work to determine that a mentoring program is needed, or they might be leading with solutions. So what I mean by that is they may have decided a mentoring program is the way to go, and the reality is you really can't go wrong with mentoring programs. However, they may not have done the work to actually confirm that there's a gap in mentoring services or that the population that you're wanting to work with wants a mentoring program. So you'll want to clarify this with your supervisor and get more information about how the decision for a mentoring program was made, and make sure that you don't conduct your assessment with a foregone conclusion in mind, which will cause you to miss stuff. We'll talk more about that in a second, though. Sound good?
Sounds good.
All right, so I'm going to interject here for just a second. There's a lot of really good information already coming out of your conversation. So how about if we take some notes along the way so that, Jackie, you'll have something by the end of the conversation, and the folks who are listening and following along will be able to see as we captured some of these ideas. So thank you, Joanne, for pulling up the note-taking document there. We can see that now. So, so I'll leave it back to you guys to carry on, and we'll jot some notes as we go.
Thanks, Andy. Okay, so Jackie, based upon your service thus far and the information we just covered, what does community assessment mean to you?
I would say that community assessment is about gathering data in the community, learning more about the community, and for my project specifically, learning more about the youth we want to work with and giving them an opportunity to feel heard.
Nice. That's a really good start. So let's get a little bit broader. I would say, big picture, that a community assessment is about gaining a broad perspective and getting a sense of what the community needs, what resources are available, and then what opportunities or threats might exist. This information is being generated to help your organization make decisions and set priorities, and like most things, it's a process.
Okay, that makes sense.
So, hey, while we're clarifying, there are a few other things I want you to keep in mind. So remember, your assessment is about gaining a broad perspective. Now, you're working with youth, and their voice absolutely needs to be included, but you're also going to want to make sure that you're hearing from other stakeholders, like the people who are also working with youth, parents, teachers, business owners, etc.
Okay.
Also, want to emphasize that as a VISTA member, you're going to want to keep in mind that the process of completing your assessment is as important as the assessment itself.
What do you mean by that?
Well, okay, so this is your opportunity to not only learn about the community you'll be serving, but also to build rapport with your community. It's your community entry, if you've ever heard that phrase before. This is how you're going to begin building key relationships, identifying partners, and getting comfortable with what's in front of you. I think one of the coolest things about VISTAs is that they tend to come in with fresh eyes and can gain a lot of insight during their community entry periods. You're going to see things differently because you don't necessarily know about past concerns, territory issues, or small p politics. You're neutral. Because of that, this entire process has the potential to be super rich and help you get a sense of purpose for your term. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Cool. Thank you for asking me to expand on that. Okay, so let's start with the big question. From what you understand about your project at this point, what is the goal of your assessment?
Okay, well, I would say the goal is to create additional access to higher education for populations that have more barriers, and also to find out what might want to be done with the mentoring program.
Good, okay. So let's reframe that. Let's play with that a little bit. I might suggest that instead of saying the goal is to create access, maybe say the goal is to determine if there's a problem with access, and if so, what are the issues and barriers getting in the way of access? Do you see the difference there?
Yeah, so it's more focusing on the need.
Exactly. I would also suggest taking some time to visit with your supervisors and colleagues to get a sense of what the word access means to them. You know, I work a little bit in higher ed myself, and access is one of those words that gets thrown around a lot. And we all assume that we mean the same thing. However, people might have a variety of different interpretations they're using. So, for example, does access mean financial support? Does it mean social emotional support, academic support? Is it determined by enrollment? Is it determined by financial aid applications? Is it measured by retention? You see what I mean? You want to make sure that everybody's operating under the same definition, especially because that constitutes the goal of your assessment, and that's going to really help you design it.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense.
Right? And again, you'll need to ask some questions about where the idea for the mentoring program came from. If it's something that's already been confirmed as a need and an opportunity, then you'll tailor your assessment to that issue. If the organization is still in the process of determining the needs of the community they serve, then you'll want to do a broader assessment to make sure that you don't overlook different needs and solutions that might exist.
Got it.
Cool. Okay, so before we jump into the 5 key steps, tell me what you've got on your to-do list so far.
Okay, well, I should probably talk to my supervisor and ask questions about what access means, as well as some questions about the mentoring program. And I also need to make time with the advisory committee I have to make sure I'm sharing all this information and having them help me get the assessment done. Perfect.
Good stuff. Okay. Well, let's go ahead and look at the 5 steps to community assessment then. All right. So, as I'm sure you've seen, there are countless models that can be used to guide your assessment. Some are super complex and others less so. The model I use is fairly simple and focuses on the key components you'll need to incorporate, which are defining the scope, gathering data, organizing key findings, identifying priorities, and communicating next steps. We'll use this process to sort through your assessment and answer some of your questions. Each of these topics could be explored for hours, and I'm pretty sure that's not what you signed up for today. So we'll go ahead and hit each of them at a high level, make sure you see how it's connecting to your project, and then I'll get you additional resources as needed. Does that work for you?
Yeah, sounds good.
All right. Okay, so let's jump in. First step of defining the scope of your assessment is to frame the problem, which we've already began working on, and we were discussing the goal of your assessment and identifying the questions that needed to be asked in the terms that you needed to clarify. So we understand that the problem that we're investigating in your case is access for low-income and disengaged youth, and we discussed the need to define access and establish whether or not we're assessing for a mentoring program. Do you have any other questions about that right now?
No, I feel good about that.
Okay, perfect. So unfortunately, because those pieces still need to get sorted out, we'll need to talk in more general terms about the rest of this, but it should all still feel really applicable.
Okay.
Cool. Okay, so our next step is to identify a few questions that we want to answer with this assessment. So let's assume that we're assessing for gaps in services. What questions do you need to have answered in order to accomplish that?
Okay, so I'll need to clarify things with my supervisor about the scope and the goal, but I believe we need to ask questions to determine what access barriers exist for low-income youth, what the impacts are when this population lacks access, and what can be done to help.
There's that access word again, I'm telling you. That's a super good start. So, and especially considering that you've got a bunch of things that you still need to finalize and clarify. I noticed that you didn't mention asking what is already being done to address the problem and behaviors, and you're definitely going to want to make sure that you're getting that information. So this is how we keep ourselves from duplicating effort and competing with our community for resources. For example, seeing as you may be pursuing a mentoring program, you're definitely going to want to make sure that you're looking at what mentoring programs already exist and whether or not another one is needed. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I do know there are some other mentoring programs out there working on similar issues.
Yeah, exactly. Those folks will show up as stakeholders when we cover them in a minute, but let's go ahead and identify the community that you're working within first.
Well, I know we're looking specifically at our local community, so there's some geographic components. I also know we're working on college access for this campus, so I imagine our community would also be current and potential students. And I could probably access enrollment records somewhere on my college's website and get a better sense of where they're coming from in the community. And because my site has been specific about disengaged, low-income young people, I would say that our community is refined by those parameters as well.
Great. Good stuff. Okay. And confirming the geographic scope is definitely going to help you wrap your head around the assessment. And it's a great idea to see if you can find out where the majority of the students at your institute are coming from to help you target some of those geographic efforts. You know, on the one hand, this is going to give you good insight as to what your existing community is, where those students are coming from. And then on the other hand, it might also give you a sense of where you aren't drawing students from, and you and your advisory council can decide if you'd like to target some of those areas as well and consider that they probably have different needs and barriers.
Okay, got it.
Cool. All right. that's a great start for thinking through your community. So let's hop to beneficiaries. So you've mentioned disengaged low-income youth. How are you guys defining that?
Well, we've also been focused on homeless youth.
Okay, now that's a population that really needs support. I'm glad to hear that. Who else have you talked about? Have you identified other ways to define low-income youth?
Not really. That seems where the focus is. I'm also seeing a need to serve populations where there's disproportionality in who's low income and their access to school. So that could include communities of color and other areas of the county that are especially low income.
Sure. No, I'm glad to hear that you're already looking into the data and starting to identify those themes and needs. And I would say another piece that you might want to clarify with your supervisor and advisory committee is how you're defining it. If the goal is really focused on homeless youth in particular, that's great. That's super specific. However, the project goal that you're working with seems much broader. So encompassing a broader section of low-income disengaged youth might be good. And like you're saying, you're already identifying some trends when it comes to other populations. So I'd suggest getting more information about whether or not you need to include a broader spectrum of beneficiaries, or if you're just focusing on homelessness. If the goal is broader, I would also suggest looking at data surrounding youth risk behaviors and poverty for your community to help you hone in on other beneficiaries. In specific, I often reference the Youth Risk Behavior Survey as well as the Prevention Needs Assessment. So these are two different federal data sources, and they're completed on offsetting years, and they will give you a ton of great insight regarding what's happening with youth in your area.
Okay, I'll do that. Thanks for sharing with me. It's helpful. I'm also planning on looking at the data of dropout and retention rates through the university and in the Department of Education.
Perfect. Those are going to be great resources, and we'll touch on those again when we start discussing gathering data.
Okay, perfect.
Great. Okay, so back to defining the scope. So we've covered framing the problem, identifying the questions to be answered, identifying the community, and identifying beneficiaries. So talk to me a little bit about stakeholders. Who have you identified for your stakeholders so far?
Okay, I want to make sure that I'm understanding what you mean by stakeholders. When I hear that, I'm assuming you mean everyone who has an interest or impact on the project. So that could be local high schools, nonprofits working with youth, parents, students. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. Stakeholders represent a variety of different community members who are invested in what we're doing. So who else can you think of for your stakeholders?
People working in the courts and in the criminal justice system, coalitions focused on youth and also healthcare agencies, looking more at who impacts my project. This could include groups focused on issues like mental health, institutional racism, homelessness, anything that could affect youth.
Great. Those are perfect examples. And I would also be sure to include as many youth-serving agencies as possible, as they're likely going to have a ton of insight and information for you, in addition to access to the voices of the youth that you're hoping to work with. I would also suggest identifying other organizations and civic entities that serve low-income populations as stakeholders. Basically, you're looking for stakeholders working with youth, working with education, and working on issues of poverty.
A lot of different agencies.
I know, it totally is. But just think of it as part of your assessment. As you're pulling together your list, you're also beginning to compile data. So none of us is working in a silo, and a running list of partners and stakeholders is really critical to our work. And just think about how great that list of stakeholders will be for your organization or even potentially another VISTA.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, good. There's way more to say about this, but I do want to make sure that we keep moving forward. We've spent a lot of time discussing the goal and scope of your assessment, and that's because if you do the work up front, the rest of the assessment will come easier. One of my favorite quotes from Albert Einstein says, if you give me an hour to solve a problem, I'll spend 55 minutes defining it and 5 minutes solving it. Identifying your goals and defining the scope is your 55 minutes. Once that's ironed out well, the rest of the steps will come easy.
Sounds good.
Okay. All right, well, let's jump in and talk a little bit more about gathering data. So generally speaking, there are three primary ways to gather data for your community assessment. You can source federal statistics, you can collect local indicators, and then you're going to solicit community member personal experiences. So our federal statistics represent data usually derived from the U.S. Census Bureau about the nation's people and economy. Every 10 years, the Census Bureau conducts the population and housing census, in which every resident in the United States is counted, and it includes things like transportation, justice, labor, energy, agriculture, health, education, and many more. These stats can be viewed in a variety of ways and give you the ability to look at what's happening nationally, what's happening in your state, and what's happening in your community. This serves us really well because it allows us to track trends over the course of decades, as well as allowing us to compare our community to others. Now, while the stats are great at helping us understand what problems exist, they don't always help explain why the problem exists or give us insight into what specific factors contribute to them in our community. So it's important to dig further, starting with community-level indicators. Community-level indicators represent the facts and figures that we can pull from our community that give us additional insight into the community problem. So, for example, if you were working on an intervention for child abuse, you could potentially work with your local hospital to find numbers for how many child abuse-related injuries they treated the past year. Or in your case, since your project has an interest in working with homeless youth, you could potentially contact your local shelters and find out how many individuals under the age of 18 that they've served. So these aren't numbers that you're going to find at a national level, but are generally available locally and give you a lot of insight into the need that you're addressing. Now, the final and maybe most important piece is to solicit information about community member experiences. This helps us put the federal statistics and the community indicators into context, and it helps us begin to understand why a particular problem exists. But more importantly, hearing directly from the people who are being impacted by the problem helps us better understand what they think they need and what they believe would help most. So let's go ahead and sort through each of these for your project.
Sounds good.
Okay. So here's a screenshot of the website that you can visit to source your federal stats. I mentioned all of the various topics that are included in the federal statistics pulled by the Census Bureau, and you probably recognize that many of those represent the indicators that are used to measure poverty. So you'll want to begin by pulling the data for your community to get a sense of what poverty looks like. You might have actually already done this if you completed the community profile activity on VISTA campus. Did you do that one?
Yeah, that sounds familiar. I'll take a look at the community profile created and see what I can add to, or see what from that I can add to what we already have planned. Our discussion about how we define the community and beneficiaries might also help me to refine the searches to get more specific data about the target population.
Okay, cool. Well, and I also mentioned the Youth Risk Behavior Survey and the Prevention Needs Assessment, which are excellent data sources for youth. Both of those are national studies administered through the government as well, but are focused more on youth and poverty. And as we all know, poverty impacts everything, so as you're looking at that youth data, do your best to bring it alongside the poverty data and see what correlations you can draw. Again, your advisory committee will be an awesome resource for you as you're looking at those sources together.
Okay, got it. Are there any other sources similar to the Youth Risk Behavior Survey or the Prevention Needs Assessment that I can look at?
Oh, super good question, and I know there are tons of other sources out there. Hey, Andy, what do you think about asking the folks that are listening in to share some of the sources they're familiar with?
Yeah, that's a great idea, Shannon, and we have available to us the chat window there. So as Shannon just framed the question, what other data sources have you referenced in order to better understand your community or to contribute to or help you complete a community needs assessment? So these could be local, they could be regional, they could be national data sets. So we're going to use the chat window. If you don't see the chat, look in the upper right corner, click on that little speech bubble to open it up, and be sure to send to all participants. So we've got some ideas coming in here already. The American Community Survey. Yep, that's one that's part of the U.S. Census Bureau stuff and is part of the community profile activity that we have on the VISTA campus. Let's see, Catherine says in her county, United Way recently did an assessment, so that's a great resource. And in general, United Ways and other community foundations, community organizations often do needs assessments for their catchment areas. Ellie notes the kids count data, so that's a great one for youth-related data as well. Okay, now they're coming in really fast, so it's harder to see. Poverty assessment by school districts, National Survey on Drug Use and Health. More locally, your Chamber of Commerce or community college can be a great source of data. Lots of good ideas here. So, Jackie, what do you think? Do any of these sources that we've seen so far from your colleagues, any of these seem like they will be useful or lead you in a direction you hadn't thought of?
Yeah, they sound good. And there's a bunch I haven't heard of, so thanks, everyone.
Yeah, and there are ones I haven't heard of in here either, so, so we'll be capturing these. So keep them coming. If you haven't had a chance to put your own favorite data source up there, please continue to add. So Shannon, back to you.
Awesome. Thank you, everybody. There are a few in there and some throwbacks for me as well as some new ones, so I'll be looking at that sheet as well. Okay. So, Jackie, before we move forward, I do want to show you just one other tool that I recently found that I think is really great, and I feel like it really kind of makes pulling together all the poverty statistics really easy. So, this is a populations at risk tool that was developed by a local nonprofit here in Bozeman, actually, called Headwaters Economics, and they use this data to inform community planning and land management decisions. It's amazing, and it was actually passed along to me by some current VISTAs who knew that I would get a kick out of it. All you need to do is insert the name of the community that you're working with, and it's going to generate 30 pages of data surrounding poverty issues in your community. It's got everything from education attainment, race and ethnicity, individuals in poverty, families in poverty, households receiving public assistance, labor participation, you name it. Now, I understand that you actually already used this and pulled some data for your community to look over. So what did you discover? How do you see yourself using that?
Well, just looking at it quickly, I found that Whatcom County has a slightly higher number of people in deep poverty than in the U.S. The county also has a pretty high population of white folks compared to the rest of the country. And the number of people without a high school diploma is actually lower than the rest of the country. I also found that the price of housing in the county is increasing, which I'm sure is pretty common everywhere, and it's making it harder for people to find housing. So, yeah, all these things are important for me to keep in mind when researching for the assessment, and I plan to use this information to gain knowledge about the climate, about where I am, and how many people might be in the population that I'm focused on.
Sweet, nice. I love that you're already jumping into that. It's a great sign. Okay, so I mentioned that your federal stats are going to give you a lot of information to work with and should provide you with quite a few insights about your community and the beneficiaries that you're targeting through your project. That said, you're also going to want to identify your community level indicators, right? So those local facts and figures that you can use to further your understanding of what's happening around you. Now, we already talked about potentially finding out how many homeless youth there are in your community. What other community indicators might you want to consider?
Well, I'd like to find out how the campus is tracking low-income student enrollment and retention and see if I can access that figure. I'd also like to take stock of how many low-income youth are already receiving support in higher ed through programs or services like SAT courses, FAFSA-WAFSA coaching, scholarship programs, and things related to that. It also seems like this is where I would want to try and capture data on the other mentoring programs.
Yes, exactly. Now, you can definitely look at existing programming and count those as community indicators, and I would definitely say you should. Now, here's the big question of the day, though, right? When we're talking about community indicators, where are you going to find this information?
Well, I'm fairly certain I can find the educational data through my campus and the Department of Education, and for Washington State, I believe it's OSPI. As far as finding data on the number of homeless youth, I can look at the point-in-time count, which was actually done last week, and they do it nationwide, and it looks at anyone who's homeless on that given day of the year. I can also ask partners for any information that's not on that count. And as far as mentoring programs, I'd probably have to generate that number myself, but I'm sure the Western Washington University would have some information on that as well.
Yeah, bingo. Unlike federal stats, which are kind of gift wraps for us, community-level indicators require a bit more digging and investigating on our end. So as you've identified, sometimes that data is being gathered by the city or county, and a visit to a local library or city-county building will point us in the right direction. Other times we're looking at a softer figure, right, like the number of homeless youth, and that might be gathered by partners or stakeholders who share in our work. In my experience, it is always worth asking our partners if we can see their data. I personally had a lot of luck with that approach, and I can only think of a handful of times I've been turned down. And I think every single case there was a restriction on behalf of a funder. And then there are times when we have to get a figure that nobody's collecting, and it's up to us to develop a system and start gathering it.
That makes sense to me, and it seems like a lot of this will come out when I'm collecting community member experiences, right?
Yes, absolutely. Let's go ahead and jump into that. So, mentioned earlier, we have the 3 kinds of data we're collecting, and the final type of data that you're going to want to gather might be some of the most important data you gather, and that's community experiences. So this is where you're using tools like surveys, focus groups, interviews, and observation to get a better sense of what people's lives look like day to day, what barriers they perceive, and what services they feel they need. As I mentioned before, the goal in gathering data about community experiences is to try and get additional insight to help you interpret what you found when you were looking at your stats and indicators. That information is pretty much meaningless until you talk directly to the people who are experiencing those circumstances, as well as the people who are serving those populations alongside you. They know the stories, and they understand the complexity of the people experiencing poverty in your community. I think this is really where that notion of intersectionality comes into play. So you might be able to articulate that there are housing issues in your community, and you might be able to get a figure that tells you how many people are receiving meal assistance, but until you understand how those 2 things operate together for real people and what factors might be driving them both, like lack of jobs, you can't really begin to think through the solutions. You also have to use this as an opportunity to ask your target group what they need. For example, I once worked with a guy who was developing programming to help young women obtain their high school diplomas. They tried a bunch of interventions, academic mentoring, job coaching, assistance with technology, but they weren't really making an impact. So they looked a little closer at the community they were serving, and they realized that the bulk of the population was made up of single mothers. When they asked these women what they needed to succeed, they were unanimous in saying childcare. So the program focused on addressing the child care needs of their targeted group, and as a result, they were much more successful in meeting their goals. I want to pause because this is a super important principle for you to understand. We have, again, this notion of developing a mentor program, and again, that might be spot on, or there might be another issue at play for your target population, like lack of transportation or access to internet, and that might even help them more. So you just really need to be neutral in your approach and really listen. So with that, what questions do you have?
Well, I completely understand what you're saying about listening to people's experiences. That actually what inspires me most. But honestly, I don't feel like I know nearly enough about the surveys and focus groups and how they work. How do I design and run them, and how will I know if I'm doing it right?
Okay. I think I'm picking up on 2 separate discomforts here, so let me see if I can address those separately. Okay, so first off, it sounds like you feel you need more information on these strategies. Again, we could do an entire session on any of these topics, but we don't have that kind of time, so let me show you a great resource. This is the Kansas University Community Toolbox, and I promise you, you will find everything you need to properly plan and execute on your community experience activities by reading through these resources. There's an entire section dedicated to focus groups, an entire section dedicated to interviewing, and an entire section dedicated to utilizing surveys. They each include step-by-step instructions, checklists, templates, and links to further resources. Seriously, anything you need to tactically execute can be found right here.
Awesome. Yeah, that sounds good. I think that actually looks pretty familiar. It has a lot of different information.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so with that, I also sense that you might be feeling a little bit uneasy because this is all new. And as humans, we get a little nervous doing new things, especially when we're working with the public. I think that oftentimes we talk about surveying and interviewing from this like really academic place and assume that we need to approach this as if we're elite researchers. The truth is you need to just give it a go. Make sure you look over the resources you have, make a plan, and ask questions from your support system. Those are the good practices. But ultimately, you need to settle into the discomfort and just put yourself out there. If you don't, you're never going to learn how to do it, and you won't get what you need. And honestly, Jackie, the reality is I still get nervous when I have to put myself out in front of new groups. Just a few weeks ago, I had to attend a community meeting where I didn't know anybody. I was there on behalf of the service group I participate in, and I was trying to find out why we suddenly had 3 cult drives happening simultaneously for a town of 1,200, mind you, when our group had been running one for several years. We got it all figured out, and everybody was super great, but I totally was jumpy when I walked into the room. There were a bunch of people I'd never met, and I was worried about saying the wrong thing or doing something stupid. I think that the need to feel competent and accepted never really goes away. And in my experience, these types of activities are going to draw that out no matter how accomplished we are. So that feeling of discomfort doesn't really go away, but we get better the more we do it, and we learn to be okay with the discomfort because we know it's temporary. And just rest assured, you will mess something up. We all make mistakes. We all fail here and there, and I always say fail fast and fail often. It's unavoidable, and it's best just to get it out of the way so we can keep improving.
Okay, thanks. I appreciate that.
Wow, you bet. Okay, so let's keep moving. So the next step is really straightforward, and it's simply organizing your key findings or summarizing your assessment. Now, I say it's straightforward, but it does require critical thinking, and as I'm sure you can sense, there's a good chance that you'll be generating a lot of information. Because of that, you'll want to make sure your supervisor and advisory committee peel through all of this with you and help you tease out the most salient points. Now, that's not because you're not capable, but because the step is best served by multiple minds and multiple perspectives. Because the volume of information can sometimes feel overwhelming, I like to give myself categories to work with to help me sort out my thoughts. There are several models you can use to process the information, but for most purposes, you only need 3. Clarifying the problem, summarizing existing services and resources, and identifying the gaps. So let's run through what each of these categories looks like real quick so you can get a sense of how you might organize your findings. So you're already kind of starting, and we started with a problem, which right now seems to be a lack of college access to higher education for underrepresented populations. This first one is where you're going to clarify your terminology and target population and use data to demonstrate the problem. It seems like you've already taken quite a few steps in organizing your assessment, and you and I have already covered a ton today. So why don't you tell me how you might go about clarifying the problem when you organize your findings?
Okay, so we talked about needing to clarify the term access, and I might find other terms that need to be more defined too. We've also talked about refining my understanding of my target group, and this is where I will clearly outline the population I'm assessing. Finally, I'll use data to demonstrate the needs of populations as well as indicators of the problem. So this is where I'll provide data on the demographics I'm targeting, as well as data from my institutions and maybe others about dropout rates, enrollment, retention, et cetera. I'm going to compare the data against the data from other communities and national figures to get a sense of how big the problem is in my community. I might also include other relevant community indicators and narratives from the community experiences in this section to further emphasize the problem and discuss complexities related to the quantitative data.
Perfect. Those are all definitely ways that you might be able to use your assessment to clarify. Cool. Okay, so next, you're going to summarize the information you gathered about relevant resources and services in your community. Generally, these are referred to as the strengths of your community and are often found through activities like asset mapping. So this is where you're going to drop in your list of community partners, programs that are working on the same or similar issue you are, and community resources that are currently being used or could be used to address the problem. So for you, examples might include libraries that have free access to technology or transportation services that reach campus, things like that. Just remember that the goal is to paint a comprehensive picture of everything happening in your community and all of the resources that may represent possibilities for your organization. This will help ensure that you aren't duplicating efforts and also give you and your organization's decision makers a sense of what's available to work with, who you might partner with, and then ultimately where the energy is for this cause in your community. The final piece is to identify gaps in services or the weaknesses in your community regarding the problem that you're trying to solve. Information about gaps in services might show up in all of your data categories. So you might find information when looking over federal statistics to help you better understand the barriers for your target populations. Or you may discover a community indicator that helps you better understand why your target population is struggling. Most importantly, you'll hear about gaps and weaknesses directly from your target populations and partners when you're collecting information about community experiences through your surveys, interviews, and focus groups. I would say it's important to spend the bulk of your time with this particular data source as you try to identify gaps, because the community members will tell you which of those gaps are having the greatest impact on them. Before we move on, it's also worth mentioning that it's not uncommon to realize that you need to answer another question or gather a new piece of data based upon what you find when you organize your key findings. So let's say you complete all of your data gathering activities, and in looking over the results, you realize you needed to generate a number to better understand low-income youth receiving disability services on your campus. If that happens, go back and find the information. The process isn't always linear, and I definitely recommend not moving on until you feel like you have all the information you need to make a decision.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, that seems more straightforward to me now. Thanks for talking about that more in detail.
Yeah, you bet. All right, we're rounding the plate towards home. We've got one last major piece, which is setting your priorities. So I stated at the very beginning of our conversation that the purpose of the assessment is to gather data to assist with decision making and setting key priorities. You have to make sure you get your assessment to this place so it doesn't end up just sitting on a binder on a shelf somewhere. When we're talking about setting your priorities, we're really talking about closing your assessment. So there are a few methodologies that you can use to identify your priorities, but I'm going to focus you in on answering a few essential questions.
Sounds good.
Okay. So as you look at your key findings and you reflect on your project goals and organization mission, ask yourself the following. First, what is our vision for the future? So for you and your project, you're wondering, what does increased access look like? And you're thinking about the population you're trying to empower and how their lives are better now. Next, ask, what's already being done to support this vision? So this is where you're listing out what's currently being done to support the population and address the community problem that you've identified. The next question is, what gaps exist? So this is where you're going to reflect upon what you heard from your beneficiaries and stakeholders regarding the barriers that exist and the things that aren't working. The next question is, what opportunities exist? And I like to think about this as turning that gap into a possibility, right? So instead of saying, for example, there's no transportation available for our target population to reach campus, we can say there's an opportunity to have a major impact on our target population by addressing their transportation needs. It might feel a little bit redundant, but reframing the gap as an opportunity really puts our thinking into a creative place, and I found that helps move folks forward. And there's one final question, and this is a really important one. When you look at the opportunities and gaps, ask yourself, based upon our mission, resources, and skills, which of these can we address? This is an important question because as you're completing your assessment, there's a good chance you're going to come across a lot of issues, and you're going to see how these issues intersect. And that can be really overwhelming because oftentimes it's revealing some of the deeper and darker societal problems we're up against. Things like how race and gender influence poverty, or how our economic system disproportionately impacts certain populations. You have to remember that we're all working on our small piece of the puzzle. I like to say we all got to eat this elephant one bite at a time. You're going to identify a lot of problems that need to be solved, and you need to be honest with yourself about which of those you can. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does. And thanks for saying that. Yeah, I always find myself asking questions about how equity plays into the problem, which is most of it. And it seems overwhelming to think about fighting these large systems by myself, but thinking about it as part of the puzzle is definitely helpful.
Yeah, for sure. And I'm glad that you are identifying those things, and I encourage you to keep focusing on that. Keep it at the forefront, and when it's time to make decisions and establish priorities, just do your best to work with your team and figure out ways that you can have the greatest impact in bringing those concerns into your priorities. Good stuff, Jackie. Okay, one last piece, and it's as easy as it is important. You have to make sure that you can communicate about your next steps back out to the community. So this includes everybody in your organization, staff, board members, advisors, and others. Make sure everybody understands the work that was completed and how it's being used. Next, you'll want to share with your partners. So chances are their input and support will inform your assessment a great deal. And you'll want to share how you use that information to identify priorities and let them know what your next steps are. And then finally, you'll want to communicate your findings and next steps to your stakeholders and beneficiaries. I talked about this a whole lot more in a webinar I did called Demystifying Stakeholder Engagement, which you can find on the VISTA campus. But just understand that reporting back and loop closing with our constituents is an important way that we demonstrate respect and promote buy-in to our work. So communicating back is super easy and it's really intuitive, but it's often overlooked. So don't forget to do that.
Okay, no problem.
All right. Cool. Well, we're getting near the end of our time. We've gone a little bit over here, so let's go ahead and why don't you tell me, big picture, what information have you received?
Well, community assessment is a process with a lot of different components, and when doing the assessment, there are many choices I have to make, but there are tools and knowledge out there in the community that I can use to help find out what the problem is and ways to go about addressing it.
Awesome. And what are your first steps going to be?
Well, first I'll probably talk to my supervisor to clarify the purpose of the community assessment so I can define the scope, and make time with the advisory committee to share information you gave me here and see how they can help with this.
Awesome. Perfect, Jackie. Girl, I think you're going to do a fantastic job on this. Your organization honestly is lucky to have you. You're bringing such good thinking and you're already resourcing this so well. So don't forget to check out that KU Community Toolbox. There's so much there. I'm telling you, I use it pretty frequently. So before we wrap up, is there anything else you'd like to ask? Anything else you need?
No, I think I'm good for now.
Awesome. Cool. Well, thank you very much, Jackie.
Yeah, thanks.
All right. Thank you both, Jackie and Shannon, for really great conversation here and a lot of information around community assessments. We're going to get to the Q&A portion of our program, but before we do, just want to point out we've got an evaluation poll that's opened up on the right side of the screen. Please take a couple of minutes to fill that out. We really do value your input. What went well about this, what you liked, where we might improve, and if you have ideas for other topics that you'd like to see on future webinars, please add those as well. There are 10 questions, so you need to use the slide bar on the right to scroll down to see all the questions. And because we opened the poll, of course, the Q&A and the chat panel is closed. To reopen them, you can just click on the little caret or the little triangle next to those, and they will reopen. All right, so Shannon and Jackie gave us all a lot to think about. So it is time for the Q&A portion. You've got two ways that you can ask a question, as you know, through the Q&A panel in WebEx. And now I'm going to ask our operator to come back online so those of you who are dialed in by phone can ask a question verbally.
Thank you. If you would like to ask a question over the phone, please dial *1, unmute your phone, and record your name when prompted. Again, dial *1, unmute your phone, and record your name when prompted. To withdraw your question, dial *2. One moment, please, while the questions queue.
All right, and while we're waiting for questions to come in on the phone, we've got a few lined up here already. There are a couple of questions that came in early in the session, both of them relating to advisory groups, community advisory groups, or advisory committees. So first of all, Rose asked, how do I put together an advisory group if our organization doesn't even have any community volunteers? So, Jackie, you have some thoughts about that?
Yeah, so this was told to me by my supervisor, but for my project, I talked to a lot of different people at nonprofits and at the college, and I was kind of directed a little bit by my supervisor, so I asked them to be on the advisory committee, and that's how I put it together. So I also don't have any volunteers or anything like that currently.
All right, great. So just to follow up on that, do you remember, like, out of 10 people that you asked, how many of them agreed to be on the committee? Do you have like a proportion, a success rate?
I asked about 12, and all of them agreed. I also told them that if they couldn't make a meeting, they could send someone in their place, so someone usually from their department. And the only person who didn't stay on the committee just found someone that he thought would better fit the committee.
Okay, great. The other question, also related to advisory groups, is whether there's some kind of an outline for the roles and responsibilities, or like maybe a job description or volunteer description for advisory group members. So do either of you have thoughts about that?
I didn't find anything specific about roles. I don't know, just Shannon, do you know more about that?
Yeah, for sure. So I would say a good place to start with that KU Community Toolbox, we really highlighted the resources that are relevant toward gathering data for community member experiences. But again, they have an entire module on advisory groups. And so when you go through there, you're going to see a lot of different sort of formats that you can use for an advisory group, a lot of different purposes. Is it a task force? Is it a council? Is it a work group? So giving you a sense of what that objective is, what kind of a timeline you want to put around it, and then they do have some resources to support looking at position descriptions, methods of accountability, things of that. So I would say definitely start with the KU work group. And then Education Northwest, which is one of the partners putting on this webinar today, if you just Google Advisory Committee Education Northwest, you're going to come up with a multi-page document that actually has a lot of good resources for structuring your advisory committees as well. So I think those are both strong resources.
All right, great. Thanks for those suggestions. Let's pause and see if we have anybody on the phone who's got a question.
We have a question from Daphne. Your line is now open.
Yes. I just had a question in regards to the community database that you mentioned. I didn't get the name of it. You said that it identifies everything about that particular community so that you can compare it with other communities.
Yeah, you bet. There were two that we mentioned. So the one is just the federal site where you can go to the U.S. Census Bureau, and that's where you're going to draw data for a variety of different sources. So that would be one of them. And then the other one is called the Populations at Risk tool, and that's something that was generated out of a nonprofit here in Montana. And while it doesn't pull every single thing, there's so much data available, it does create 30 pages of data that you can source based on zip code, town name, things of that nature. So it's a great starting point and really kind of makes that process a lot more efficient. Is that what you were looking for, Daphne?
Yeah, and it's called Populations at Risk tool?
Yeah, Populations at Risk. And I think, and Andy, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure we'll link to that in the resources for this webinar.
Yeah, absolutely, we will. And also, Jasmine, if you can scroll up through the chat, the links for both of those are listed there as well. But they'll definitely be in the resources that we post afterwards.
And I had one other question. One of the things that I was thinking about doing is trying to build a coalition, because I'm having, it's a community of 2,400, and that's everyone, kids included. And I thought if I build a coalition, I probably would have a better opportunity to raise money for the goals that we have. Can anybody comment on if you heard of anyone building a coalition to help with the assessment and the community overall goal?
I've only attended coalitions that were already in the community, but maybe Shannon knows more about building one.
Yeah, so a couple of things that come to mind. I mean, again, I would say looking at all of the advisory committee resources that we just shared is going to be a great starting point for you. Oftentimes, when we're looking at coalitions, they sort of fall into that same framework, and a coalition would be a really, really advanced, formalized advisory committee in many ways. So I think starting there, and then I might also suggest, I referenced briefly the Demystifying Stakeholder Engagement webinar that I did last year that you can find on the VISTA campus. But within that webinar, we talked a whole lot about how do you start cultivating community members to bring them through a pattern of development that's going to get them to a point where they're ready for that level of responsibility and willing to take it on. So I would say, again, take a look at KU. The KU work group, which we referenced multiple times, just to kind of start getting a sense of what the right body you need is. And then you can also be looking, I would start with that webinar too, just because it is a small community, to figure out how can you start identifying stakeholders and cultivating them to that level of ownership.
Okay. And the KU is we're talking about the model that we were just talking about, right?
Yes, ma'am.
KU. Okay. Just want to make sure. Okay. All right. Thank you very much. You're welcome.
All right, thanks. Do we have anyone else on the line at this time?
We're showing no further questions at this time.
All right, again, if you're dialed in and you want to ask a question, press *1 on your phone. Meanwhile, we'll go back to questions that have come in online. So here's another question related to data sources. Jasmine asks, where's a good place to get information on new American groups like refugees, immigrants, etc.? So any thoughts or recommendations there?
For me, I know the main thing I know of is census data offers some of that. Also for, I forget what it's called, I think education and instruction. Here it's Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction, but they offer information about like, I guess, immigration status in schools. But beyond that, I'm not sure.
Yeah, there are a couple sources out there, and I'm having a hard time pulling them to mind, but I can certainly pass them along. But the piece I want to say is that, when we're looking at sort of new American status, oftentimes all we're going to find federally are just kind of, as Jackie mentioned, immigration status. And so what I have found is when we're looking at those particular populations and communities, we're really looking at, again, those community indicators, right? There's just a variety of reasons why those folks don't necessarily show up on the federal stats and aren't participating in that work as much. And so I'm thinking if you're looking to source that for your particular area, that you might be looking more at community indicators and finding out who else in your community is serving that population, what data are they gathering, and kind of working from that angle.
And also, I know someone who serves that population at a college in Washington, so maybe if you contact me somehow, I can send you a PowerPoint she sent me that would include. some information.
Okay, great. Yeah, so if you want to get that, send us your email and through the Q&A, and we'll get that to Jackie so she can forward that on. And just to note, there were a couple of folks had great suggestions in the chat a little bit earlier to that question. One mentioned the UN High Commission for Refugees. Another was looking at immigrant refugee resettlement organizations that could be local or national organizations, as well as groups like the Red Cross and others who are involved in some of those resettlement programs. Okay, next up, we have a question from Catherine. This is around the data collection piece. So she asks, how do I balance creating a survey that captures all the data I need with one that's not too long?
That's a hard question. For me, when I was considering sending out a survey, maybe having it be a shorter survey, but also having like open-ended questions. But yeah, Shannon, do you have anything more to add to that?
Oh, sure. I mean, I've seen that a whole lot, right? Because the longer the tool is, the less likely people are to actually complete it and give you what you need. So I would say, if you genuinely feel like that tool is too long, then you've got to figure out what of that information is actually critical. So what information can you get by looking at stats? What information maybe are your partners already collecting that you don't need to ask for? And get that tool as condensed as you can, as precise as you can. Because again, for every extra question, you can assume there's one fewer person filling it out. And when, if you don't feel like you can source the information you need through stats and partners and the indicators and numbers that they're pulling together, then you might very well be looking at needing to do a focus group instead of a survey. So just that would be my advice, is step back, figure out where you can get the information that you've had on there, what of that information is truly, truly key, and just be mindful of people's time. And if you can't get it down to a reasonable place, then you're looking at buying pizza, doing outreach, and getting people in a room for a conversation probably.
Yeah, and just one other approach to possibly consider, again, depending on resources and depending on your access to the population you're trying to survey. One technique that we've used here sometimes is to break up the survey questions into smaller surveys and then get a really representative sample, randomize it, and you ask some people one set of questions and another set of people a different set of questions, and then there are a few questions that overlap, so you can kind of make sure that the groups are similar enough that you can, draw some conclusions there. So it's probably something that, an approach where you would need some expert survey or statistical guidance around, but we've been talking a lot about partners and coalitions here, and a lot of universities have departments of research and statistics, and oftentimes offer those services to organizations. So, so that's another approach you could consider. Let's see, we've got a question here around gathering community input. It comes from Julius. He says, my advisory groups prefer meeting for under an hour. My challenge is always time management when there's so much to cover. What suggestions do you have?
For my meeting, we did meet for 2 hours, but I made sure to go through and create like a document to make sure that I was going over what needed to be gone over in the meeting, and kind of tried to time it out. So yeah, that's what advice I would have for that.
Yeah, I mean, this gets to a question more about meeting management and facilitation more than anything. And so I would just first and foremost say, direct you to resources on that topic. So plug those into Google. But I think it's fine if folks, we have to remember advisors are technically volunteers, and we have to respect their time. And if an hour is what they're willing to give, that's what they're willing to give. So I always kind of encourage folks, like, do as much as you can ahead of time to prep them for the discussion that needs to happen. So don't do the reporting out. Like, give them stuff to read, resources to look over, and make sure you're using that hour you have with them for things that can only take place in person with people conversating together. So that would be my big thing. And then I also think just little things like providing an agenda ahead of time for them to all give input on to make sure they know what to expect and that they understand what your desired outcome is. And so everybody's walking in the room, resourced, on the same page about what's going to be covered and clear on the timeline. And when you're really clear on the timeline and the desired outcome, that's going to give you or whoever's facilitating the power to keep moving that conversation forward and eliminating the distractions because you have a clear understanding. So that's just kind of a real short, like, brief one, but I know that there's great information out there about meeting management and facilitation, and I would encourage you to look further into that.
Great. Great suggestions. Let's turn to the phones one more time, see if we have any callers with questions.
We are showing no questions at this time.
All right. Thank you. So let me check here in the WebEx Q&A, which is acting up for me.
Do you want me to check, Andy?
Yeah, so a couple folks have offered or expressed interest in getting that PowerPoint from Jackie, and then it looks like there's one more question beyond that, but I can't see it. Here it is.
I can jump.
Okay, so Rose says, I only have 2 months left in my project. Is it too late for me to work on conducting a community assessment?
Oh, man, let me have this one. Can I go for this one first?
Go for it, Shannon.
When I was at VISTA, I worked at a youth center, and I was tasked with supporting supportive youth directors and trying to get them to engage in fundraising and outreach activities. And it was totally pulling teeth. I can get into the reasons why, but I didn't end up beginning my community assessment until it was like my 9th month of service. And through that assessment and doing focus groups and surveying and looking at youth more broadly in the community, we actually made the decision to close that youth center and redirect that fund to other programs. So I would say absolutely not, but you just want to make sure that you're being transparent and have the blessing of your supervisor and the decision makers. But if you feel like, hey, I can still do this now, and especially if you're feeling like maybe there's a lack of alignment, I would say it's never too late. Just, again, you just want to make sure you're communicating with the right people about it. And for me, it's the joke always is I tell people my big success as a VISTA was closing a youth center. But it actually was, and it took us quite a while to come around to the fact that we were out of alignment with community, and I wish I had done it earlier.
All right, sounds like great advice. Work yourself out of a job, perhaps, right? As a VISTA. Very good. Well, I don't see any other questions now in the Q&A. One last check on the phone.
We're showing no questions from the phone lines.
Okay, terrific. Well, then, I again want to say a huge thanks to both Shannon Stober of Verge Exchange Consulting and Jacqueline Tabone from the Whatcom Community College VISTA project for your participation today, for experimenting a little bit with this format of doing a live consultation. I also want to thank our production team at Education Northwest, Bethany and Joanne, not only for all of the background support, but for note-taking and keeping us running on the rails. And I want to thank all of you for tuning in today and participating in this. Your contributions were really helpful. I also want to invite you back for another webinar in the future. We've got 2 coming up in February. You can see on the 14th, Valentine's Day, is one on using your non-competitive eligibility benefit. And then just a couple weeks later on February 27th, the power of telling your story. All of those at 2 p.m. Eastern. You'll find details on the VISTA campus. Also watch your inbox for invitations by email. Thank you all for participating. We hope to see you again soon.